Welcome, everyone. We're delighted to see you all here tonight and thrilled to bring you this special program, an insider's look into the New York Times Book Review. We have with us the two senior editors at the Book Review, so no one is in a better position to tell us how things actually work there. Pamela Paul is the editor of the Book Review and oversees books coverage at the time. She's the author of 5 books, most recently My Life with Bob, Flawed Heroine Keeps Book of Books, Plot Ensues. And our friends at Barrett's are here tonight, so that if you're interested in purchasing a book after the program, please do. Her next book is How to Raise a Reader, which will be published in September of this year. Gregory Cowles is the senior editor of the Books Desk at the New York Times and poetry editor of the Book Review. We get to call him one of our own since he lives here in Darien. Just before I turn the program over to Pamela and Greg, let me note that all of our programs are supported by the Friends of the Library. So we thank you all for your generosity in supporting this effort. And now let's have that insider's look from 2 of our very special guests. Greg, Pamela.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm looking around the room to see if I know anyone, because a couple of years ago I gave a talk at a library and my mom showed up. She didn't tell me she was coming, but I don't think she's here. You probably know more people than I do.
I do know more people. This is my local library. I know some of you in the audience. I told Pamela it's a little bit like going to the prom with my cousin.
So this is a relatively small room and intimate setting, so I thought we would keep this fairly conversational and allow a lot of time for questions after, questions about the book review, questions about the daily critics for the Times, or anything with regard to books coverage, even perhaps questions about the Times in general, although not the political coverage, not our bailiwick. And I'm going to start off by telling you just a little bit of the history of the book review and of books coverage at the Times and how that's evolved, just to kind of give you a bit of a sense of how we've evolved over time. So the book review was founded in 1896. It was founded as a separate supplement to the Times, originally on Saturday. And it's the only section of the paper that dates back to the time when there was an independent weekend and weekend edition of the Times, in the same way that there is still in the UK. Like, you have the Times of London and the Sunday Times, and they're wholly independent operations. And so we're like the appendix, like the vestigial, organ of that previous weekend edition. All of the other sections that you get on Sunday, Arts and Leisure, the magazine, evolved much later after the paper was unified. And because we were founded as an independent section, that sort of dictated certain ways in which we operate within the larger organization. So the editor of the book review has never been part of any kind of larger cultural coverage at the Times, and always reported directly to the executive editor, which is still the case today. So Dean Baquet is my boss. And the operations of the book review were always independent from the rest of the newspaper for a few very good reasons, one of which is we are one of the rare sections, I think the only section of the paper, where we really report on what other people in the paper are doing. This, as you can imagine, leads to some discomfort, because although many people think that all Times authors, people who work or report or edit at the Times, get a book review, they don't. We treat them exactly as we do everyone else at the Times. There's a little bit more rules we have in place with regard to conflict of interest, and we can talk about that later, but essentially we're in the position of having to judge our colleagues' work and determine whether it is fit for review, and then it goes out for review, and it could come back with a scathing review, and then we see our colleagues in the elevator. So we are sometimes a very unpopular section of the New York Times in the eyes of our colleagues. That said, now 3 years ago, the editor of the Times, Dean Baquet, decided that he would take the book review and finally kind of bring it into the rest of the New York Times for a few reasons. So at that time, there were 3 daily critics for the Times, and there still are. And there was the book review, and there's a publishing reporter who operated out of BizDay. And the decision was to take these 3 independent sections, which operated not only independently, but often in direct competition with one another. There were certain arcane traditions that had been in place. For example, the daily critics knew what we were doing, but we didn't know what they were doing. And in a print world, a lot of that made sense. And there is still internal competition at the New York Times in many desks and in many ways, and that can be very healthy. But when it came to books coverage, particularly the way that the book review and the books coverage appears online, that no longer made sense, because many people, many more people, alas, than read us in print, were encountering our books coverage online, and they would see 2 book reviews of the same book maybe go up within a day of each other and wonder, what the heck is this? And there were many things that at the book review things that didn't make sense to the reader. So for example, if you had 3 daily critics for the Times, they aren't reviewing a book every day. Sometimes a book would be reviewed by a freelancer. If a New York Times person wrote a book, there was the hope and dream that they would get 2 reviews, the double review, which is still like the brass ring, that and a profile as the real brass ring. But we couldn't assign a New York Times critic cannot review a New York Times writer for obvious reasons, nor the spouse of a New York Times writer, so they would assign it to a freelancer. So you might have a case where a reader would encounter not a book by the critic and a book by a Sunday reviewer, but 2 reviews by people outside the Times of the same book by someone at the Times, which frankly I don't think is a pretty look, and I also don't think it's helpful to readers. And also ends up, we ended up doing things that were not strategic in terms of how readers encountered us and also how we covered books. So if you have 3 different arms of the book of books covering the same territory, you would often end up with duplicative coverage in ways that didn't make sense. So by uniting us all, not only do you encounter something that is deliberate, and that doesn't mean that there aren't still occasionally those brass rings where someone gets 3 different kinds of coverage, but that when we do that, we're doing it for a reason, not because we're competing with each other, but we think that there is a good reason for our readers to cover that book in those particular ways. The other thing is that it enables us to preserve what makes the assigning on both of these sides make sense. And the way in which books are covered is very different between the daily critics and the book review. So to get into some specifics about what that means, it's almost like an opposite process. If you are a critic for the New York Times, then you are you just start with the critic, and let's say it's Dwight Garner. Our 3 critics right now are Dwight Garner, Parl Sagal, and Jennifer Salai. They are determining which books they think are worthy of review, and that's kind of 2 things to that. One is, what do I, as a critic, with my personal taste, let's say I'm Dwight, what do I have something to say of? What do I think that people would want to read me on? But also, as an institution, this review is coming from the New York Times. It is not coming from someone outside the New York Times for the book review. It's coming from the Times. So which books do New York Times readers expect one of our critics to weigh in on? So they're looking at both that institutional role and then also their own taste as a critic. And if you follow a critic, as many people have done for Dwight for years, and they did for Janet Maslin, who still contributes, and they did for Michiko Kakutani, who was there for 35 years, they are following that person's taste, and they get to know that critic, and they are wondering, like, well, what books does Michi think? What book does Michi think is the most important book? Or what is she going to say on this? The other thing about the daily critics is they can review every book by a particular author. So if a book by Philip Roth came out, up until his death, it was Michi, and his retirement, it was Michi who always reviewed those books. And so she could bring her knowledge of all of his previous work to bear on that review. At the book review, it's a very different process. And starting with that duplicative review, you cannot review the same person twice for the book review. So we have made a couple of small exceptions. I think Cynthia Ozick reviewed someone who 35 years ago, she had reviewed another book, and we said it's okay. Cynthia Ozick gets that right at this point in her career.
I think we've had one person review Joyce Carol Oates twice, but it's only because Joyce Carol Oates has written more books than there are people.
Yeah, well, I mean, Joyce Carol Oates is an interesting thing. We do have a JCO list, so we do have to, it's a challenge every time she comes out with a new book to find someone who hasn't weighed in on her before. And I think if it did happen, I may have been an accident with JCO because we're very very deliberate with our JCO strategy. So that's one thing. But the other thing is that the idea of the Sunday Book Review is that we are bringing people from outside the world of New York Times book critics to talk about, to write about books. And that can mean anyone from a book critic who's a freelancer, someone who might be a critic elsewhere, but not at a direct competitor. So we don't ever, there are these certain lines, no one from the Times can review someone from the Post, no one from the Journal within the book review. So there's certain exceptions to that. But we also go to people who are academics, people who are independent scholars. We go to people who are in the arts, but maybe not in the literary world. And sometimes that makes for very interesting kinds of assignments. For example, Kara Walker, who's a visual artist, reviewed the last Toni Morrison novel for us. And we thought that that would be interesting. We knew that the Daily would do it, that the Daily critics would do it. This was when we were independent, when we were independently operated. And we thought, okay, we know what we're going to get there. We have a professional critic on this. Wouldn't it be interesting to look at someone who has is dealing with similar themes to the one that Toni Morrison is writing about in this novel, but coming at it from another perspective and a different art form. So the idea with the book review is that there is a team of dedicated editors. We call them preview editors. Greg was a preview editor for how many years? 10 years.
Yep.
And preview editors generally come to the book review with, I would say, probably 10 to 15 years of experience outside the book review, often from a literary magazine, from publishing. And what their job essentially is to go through all of the books and decide which books to review. So at the book review, it's all about the editors and the editor's determination as opposed to the critics at the Daily. And then what the editor's decision is, there are really two decisions for the preview editors. One, which I would say is the most important, which books deserve to be reviewed. And the second is the most exciting and fun and creative part, and Greg can talk about that because he did that for many years and still does it to some extent, which is who should review it. And that's a very exciting question to ask because there are all these different worlds that people that we can turn to and all these different perspectives we can come at the book from. And especially now that we are unified, if we know what if the Daily Reviewer is doing and which Daily critic is doing it, we can try to do something a little bit different with what we're doing in the book review. The book review, we're trying to get a very wide range in terms of who is doing the reviewing. So trying to get fresh voices, trying to get people who are, established novelists. Conflicts of interest is a major issue because we are going outside the paper. These are freelancers. And there's also a little bit room more for individual voice in those book reviews. So if there's a Timesian voice that you might detect elsewhere in our news coverage, you won't often see that in the book review, where a lot of what we're doing is trying to preserve their own personal take. It's a kind of interesting sort of, I don't want to say purgatory. It's an interesting kind of territory between news and opinion when you are talking about a book review, because you are sort of reporting on what is in the book, but we don't want it to be a book report. We're not looking for plot summary, and you are supposed to issue judgment, and there is supposed to be opinion in there. That can make the editorial process very tricky too, because we are never going to change the judgment of the critic. That is our job as journalists, is to preserve their judgment, even when we strongly disagree with it. Maybe you can tell the Anthony Doerr story after. But so we can't change their opinion. We can only make sure that they are backing their opinion up factually. That's another thing that I think differentiates our coverage of the book review from any other review. There are places that do this, the New Yorker, the New York Review, but very few places rigorously fact check their book reviews. So the idea with a book review is that you can disagree with it, but you shouldn't distrust it. And that's why we look very carefully at fact checking and at conflict of interest. So not only can you not review, for example, in the book review, have a Times person reviewing a Washington Post person, you can't review someone who shares the same editor, the same publisher, the same agent. You can't review anyone who you've blurbed or has been blurbed by you. I can't tell you how many times we come up with the perfect person to review a book, only to find out that
That's my best friend. And I
Yes,
say, well, that's why you're the perfect person.
and, and conflicts of interest, like for us journalistically, that's one of the most important things that we have to look into. It's a constant, requires a kind of constant vigilance, because what many other places deem not a conflict of interest is a conflict of interest for us. So we will find ourselves occasionally turning down an assignment and then see, because we deem it to be a conflict of interest, and then we might see that in the New York Review. In England, for example, it's perfectly fine for known enemies to review each other. They like that. And as fun as that can be to read, that's not what we do at the Times. We're not trying to set people up. We once had someone, I don't know if this was your review, Greg, I can't remember. There was a great case where we asked someone, do you have a conflict of interest with this person? And they said, not at all. I lived with her 7 years ago, but we haven't slept together in, a long time. That person didn't get the assignment. So what this requires, what this ends up meaning in terms of like how the actual day functions, and I'll turn it over to you in a minute to talk about this because you know more, is that the book previewers get cartloads. They're actually mail cartons, is that the right word? Like
those
containers.
Plastic mail, U.S. mail things that you get when
they
you
get
come
like
back from
2
vacation.
or 3 of those every few weeks. And they have to go through all of those galleys, and they have to decide, of all the debut story collections that I have here, let's say I have 16, what are the 1 or 2 that we might review? We only review about 1% of the books that come out in a given year, and that does not include self-published books, which is really, frankly, a matter of bandwidth as much as anything else at this point, because we are already deluged with books, and we don't review books that are ebook only for similar reasons. Several of the people at the book review have been there for, they don't like me to say this, 30 years. They keep saying it's 29. It's not. It's 30 years. And having that kind of institutional knowledge and expertise is fantastic, because our preview editor, for example, in history books will say, well, this history of Poland this is just a rehashing of a book this same guy wrote 7 years ago or 14 years ago, or this is really just taking something that somebody's already done, and they have that body of knowledge to draw on. The same thing goes in terms of institutional knowledge with critics, because we have a sense of who's good and who's not good, who's good on particular books. Actually, do you want to talk a little bit about assigning?
I'd love to talk about making assignments when these big cartons come in, and Pamela mentioned galleys, which is the publishing term for books before they've published. It's not they're bound and they have kind of a fake cover on them, but it's the early version of it, and they tell you can't quote from the galley because it might change. But we're looking through those probably 2 or 3 months before the book comes out. And we're asking ourselves, when I was an assigning editor, a preview editor, I assigned mostly fiction and poetry, which I still do assign, some memoirs, some literary biography, more of the literary side of things. There's also an editor there who assigns history and kind of the military books and politics. There's an editor there who assigns the pop culture, the film and the music, things like that. There's somebody who...
I think my favorite editor to describe is, I won't say her name, she's very private, but she has to do, her areas of expertise are, she does all of the crime, she does the gardening, she does the cookbooks, she does the travel, she does anything published about England,
Japan.
She does Japan and China, she does Australia, but she only does England, sort of royal England, and sort of
Right,
upstairs, downstairs England. If it's political England, it goes on to someone else. What else does she do? She does like 10 other things. She does interior design, she does...
She gets some strange ones.
Yes. So people have, because we're very large in terms of our staff, and we're grateful to the New York Times for supporting books in this way. We are the only freestanding book review left in the country, and one of the reasons why it's been cut back at so many other papers is that it is very resource intensive. Other places will go through the books, like let's say you're the New Yorker, and this is no slander on the New Yorker, I love the New Yorker. They have 1 page for books and they have 4 briefs. So you can imagine that they don't have a full-time dedicated staff to go through every galley that's out there. When I say that we are a book review in the traditional sense, that means that we are reviewing the landscape. So every single book that comes in, we look at. We might look at it for 1 second before tossing it into the trash bin, but we are not just going through and saying, like, this looks interesting and that looks interesting. Almost everything preview editors have to go through.
And because we're trying to serve our audience, and we're the New York Times, we have a very big audience and a very an audience that has a lot of interests. It's kind of, a proudly middle-brow audience. I'd say, like, we have to cover the highbrow, we have to cover the lowbrow. We've made a real effort to extend into a more mass audience, more genre books with the thrillers. We have a romance column now. To bring in readers who've maybe felt excluded by the New York Times Book Review in the past. But because we're trying to address all of our audience, we're not only looking for the books that we personally find interesting, it's also, will our readers care about this? And sometimes when I was assigning fiction, I would read a really weird book in translation, from the Czech that was, experimental, and I would love it, and I would say, we need to cover this because it's, doing something really interesting, but 300 people might buy it. And so I would assign it at half a page and maybe give it to an academic reviewer, somebody who would recognize it for what it was, but we knew it wasn't going to have a big audience. And then I might also assign a book that we knew would be sure to be a bestseller, and that might kind of sweep every book club in the country. And I might say, it's a book that's doing what a lot of other books have done, but it's really well done, and people are going to love this book, and we should assign it. And I might assign it at a full page and look for a really big name reviewer on it. Some of the fun in making the assignments is deciding, do you want to go to the reviewer, to the celebrity reviewer, the one that people are going to say, oh, wow, Stephen King, what did he have to say about this? Because sometimes the byline on the review can sell that book as much. You're kind of making the decision in making the assignment. You're signaling the importance of the book and how much you want people to pay attention to it. In fiction, which I assigned, it was more a question of voice and style and kind of the form that it fit. For somebody like the history reviewer, we have somebody who does science books and philosophy books. It's more the argument behind it. Is it saying something new about its subject, or is it saying it in a particularly kind of eloquent or interesting way?
And sometimes it's all of those things. I mean, when it comes to the best books and making the decision about the 10 books here.
These books here are 10 best of the year.
It's everything. It's saying, like, is this doing something new and different? How is the storytelling? How is the writing itself? Is the argument new or challenging? Is the research unprecedented and original? How much work did this involve? Is this a book that will endure for a long time? And then, I would say when we're looking at books to assign, we don't necessarily think every book that we assign is fantastic. Sometimes we think that we know that people are going to be interested in the book and they're going to want a critic to weigh in on it to let you know whether it's good or bad. If John Grisham has a new book, it might not be high literature, but a lot of people love John Grisham, and it doesn't have to be high literature for someone to be able to read it and say, look, I've read 10 other John Grishams, and this one doesn't measure up, or this one is, his best in 10 years, and you want to have someone who's going to issue that kind of verdict. And the unfortunate thing about having the competitive landscape dry up so much is that there aren't as many people doing that, so that you used to have a book come out and you could expect to get a review in the Indianapolis Star and expect one to get one in the Philadelphia Inquirer. What has happened around the country, as many of you are probably aware, with the collapse of local news, I would say one of the first things to go is cultural coverage. And of cultural coverage, if you're making a decision between having someone write about TV and having someone write about books, books is going to go first. And one thing I want to emphasize in terms of talking about the changes to the Times and one of the recent reasons behind the centralization was not only strategic, but it was also the New York Times saying, you know what, no one else is doing this, or not enough people are doing this, certainly. But we think it's important. We think it's fundamental to the mission of the New York Times that our readers are interested in books. They're interested in our take on books and in having a real serious journalistic approach to books, and no one else is doing it. So we need to do that for our readers.
You mentioned the Anthony Doerr story. I will tell that story now. I was the editor who read All the Light We Cannot See when it came in galleys, and I really loved it, and I wanted to give it a big launch. And I went to somebody who was a National Book Award winner who had also had won the National Book Award for his book about World War II, which is what All the Light We Cannot See. It's a World War II story. The name of the writer I went to was William Vollmann. He was one of Granta's best young American novelists. He was one of the New Yorker's best young American novelists. He hated All the Light We Cannot See. He started his review talking about how the book was beautifully written and it kept him awake all night, turning the pages. He was completely captivated, and it was trash. And he thought it was like a comic book. He thought it was like YA. He had no patience for it. He conceded all these things that I had really loved about it and that the rest of America loved about it. But he thought it was an unserious book. And I don't know if he felt kind of directly in competition with it or if he's just a very tough critic. He's written negative reviews for us before. But I was not trying to set that book up with a negative review. I thought, here's somebody who knows the area, knows the subject, and will, be able to kind of launch this book. And instead, he really hated it. And
there's nothing we can do.
well, there is something that we can do, and that is at the end of every year, we pick our best books of the year, and I made the case for All the Light We Cannot See as a best book of the year, and we picked it as one of our 10 best of the year.
There is one little thing that we do that might not be entirely transparent to the rest of the world, but it is that every week you'll see on the bestseller list, there's a small section called Editor's Choice, and online it appears every week as 8 books we recommend this week, 10 books we recommend this week, in which we take those editors' choices and we combine them together with our critics' picks. And that is where we delicately sometimes overturn, from the editor's perspective, what our reviewers have said. So sometimes a book review comes in for a book that we adore, but we can't change their assessment. So the next week we can say, well, we liked it, and it becomes an editor's pick. And then from those editors' picks at the end of the year, which we keep a tally of, we then decide on our 10 best books of
First
the year.
we pick 100 notable books of the year.
You already have a question. Okay, so that's an interesting journalistic question. Well,
Could
you have a
everybody
choice.
hear the question? Okay.
Okay. Here's why we do it, because we're journalists, and we deemed this book worthy of assignment, and if we kill it, we're also denying the chance for that book to be reviewed, because we can't simply reassign it to someone else saying, well, we didn't like your opinion, so keep it to yourself. We're going to find someone who likes it more. First of all, they could hand it in and say, we hated it too, and then what do you do? But that's part of the sort of ethical framework for us as journalists at the New York Times Book Review. We don't overturn, we don't change, we don't kill something because it's negative. And there are 4 different kinds of reviews that you can get. So when someone says, is it a good review or a bad review? We don't actually mean, is it a positive or a negative review? It's 2 different things. So when someone hands in a review, I'm like, oh, is it good? And they'll be like, yeah, it's good. He hated it, but in a really interesting way. And he had these really smart criticisms. So there's a good positive review, which is great. There's a good negative review, also can be very fun. There was a great negative review that Michael Kinsley wrote for us probably around 6 years ago now, and I put it on the cover because it was a review of a book called Double Down that was a follow-up to a book called Game Change that was a huge bestseller turned into like an HBO movie. You may remember it. It was about, which campaign? Was it about the 2000 campaign? Or I think it was about the 2000 campaign? I'm sorry? It was with Palin, right? It had very good actors.
It was Obama McCain.
It was Obama McCain.
Yeah.
They then did a follow-up, which is what people do. That works, so then we'll do it again. And Michael Kinsley basically said this is an entirely cynical book, and it's about one of the most boring presidential campaigns ever. And it had so it was a positive, it was a good negative review. Then there is the bad positive review where the person loves it, but is like gushing and unpersuasive and they're not backing it up and it might be terribly written. And then there's the bad negative review. And that's the one that's the hardest. And if anything ever gets killed, it's because generally speaking, we don't do it, and we only do it if we have huge amounts of inventory. We're going to be very late on it.
Right. We kill things for logistical reasons more than for editorial reasons.
Yeah, but if somebody hates a book and hates it in a bad way, and it's not convincing, and we don't feel comfortable with it, we might end up killing it eventually because it feels like there's no reason to really run it. It's not serving any purpose.
We don't tell somebody what to think, but we are editors and we do edit the pieces, and we will push back on a reviewer and say, you need to back this up, or can we get more quotes from the book, or we try to make the pieces, even a bad negative review, we'll try to turn it into a good negative review to the extent that we can. But we just don't try to change the opinion. We might try to draw out more of the kind of thought behind it.
I want to say one more general thing before, and then I'll go to you with the questions, and we can open it up to questions generally, which is when the Times made the decision to unite these three groups, we took a step back because we thought we could take three sections of the paper that originated during a print era of the Times for very print-centric reasons in a very different landscape when every newspaper had its daily critic, when every newspaper, or many newspapers had a publishing reporter, when many had a Sunday supplement, a totally different world. And we could smush them all together, and we could get rid of like overlapping things and make sure it's strategic. But if we were starting up books coverage at the New York Times today, would that be the best way to approach it? Probably not. So when we made that decision, we took about 4 months in which we did a lot of deep thinking, talked to many people in the industry, did research with readers around the country, flew to Minneapolis and Portland and San Francisco and other places where there are readers to figure out what should we be doing? Like, what is it that in then 2017, what do readers want from the New York Times when it comes to books? And we found that there were things that we could be doing even beyond the parameters of that publishing reporter, 3 daily critics, and the Sunday book review, that there were questions that every reader has. And when I say reader, not only reader of books, but readers of the New York Times, which is really, frankly, our reader.
audience.
That's when we talk about readers, we're talking about New York Times readers, not book readers, much as we like book readers. And there's obviously overlap. And there were questions we weren't necessarily asking, and they're the questions that all of you probably ask each other all the time, which is, what should I read? Why should I read it? Like, I've heard about this book, is it worth reading? And what do I need to know about this book so that I don't have to read it? Which is, it's been a little bit the default thing of the book review, that sort of underlying mission in a way. And also, and this I think is really important.
Talk about this book at a party, because I know it's the book everyone's talking about.
I want to sound smart. And then another thing that I think is really important, which is how books are not a rarefied thing above and apart from everything else. I think this last year has really shown that, because books have been very much about this news cycle. And what we want to do is show that books are part of a larger culture. They are part of the news. They are not a separate area. I mean, there is escape reading, and it's fantastic, and there are science fiction, not science fiction is a bad example, but there's escapist reading that has nothing to do with anything else going on in the world. But even then, it does, because the people who are being chosen as characters, the settings, it reflects our culture, and we wanted our books coverage to really show that. In the same way that if you read an essay by, let's say, Jim Ponowozek, the TV critic, where he is reviewing the debates, that's something that wouldn't necessarily have been done a while ago, but it is on television, he is the TV critic. And so we are trying to show overall in our coverage that books are a part of our culture. They're a part of this news cycle. They're a part of the world that we're living in, and that we can't just sort of review them in isolation, but we need to write about them in a way that shows that how they fit into this bigger picture.
As journalists.
As journalists too. Yeah. So we could say a lot more, but I think maybe we'll just go to questions. So I would say there are a few things that we do, like we get all their catalogs. They all come into Meet. every single publisher that wants to come in to meet with us, whether it's the University of Arizona Press or Catapult or Grey Wolf or any imprint from the Big Five, they get a meeting with us.
I personally meet with a lot of them. I met with Rutgers University Press this afternoon. When I was assigning fiction, I made a point of cultivating relationships with the small independent presses. I know Grove Press very well, individual editors and publicists. And not just Grove, but Grey Wolf, and I mean, there are,
Yeah.
as you said, thousands, and if I don't personally know the thousands of them, I personally know hundreds of them on a first name basis, and I made a point of not just cultivating those relationships, but assigning those books because they often would show you something outside of what the Big Five kind of corporate mainstream culture was doing. I found that they had interesting things to say.
And I would say that the way in which this is, again, the kind of thing that requires a significant staff to do, because it's very easy, and I don't want to name names, it's very easy if you're like a website you know which books are being pushed, you know which ones are the buzzy ones, you could just kind of write those up, right? But it's actually going through the galleys and judging on the text itself, which I have full confidence that our preview editors do. And I have to say that, that enables you to see things that you might not otherwise notice. And when previewers, once they decide which books they're going to review, generally they get their cartons, and it easily divides into like, we're not going to do this. I know we're going to do this. And then the middle ground, which is the hardest, which is, oh my gosh, I really have to dive deeply into this book, perhaps read the whole thing to decide if we're going to assign it. The most excited they are when they come in to meet with now Greg and me and David Kelly, who's a deputy editor of the book review, is when they come in and they say, this is the most incredible thing, and it's from a teeny press I've never heard of. Have you guys ever heard of X, Y, and Z? Or look at this book. It came in from $2 radio. I had very low expectations, and it's just fantastic. That's much more exciting, frankly, than coming in with a book that you kind of know that you're going to do. Then it's more interesting in terms of who's actually going to assign it and having something smart to say about it. So and at the end of the year, and publishers never believe this, but it isn't until we've finalized the 10 best, and it's in a list that I then say, like, who are the publishers? We don't pay attention to it when we're making that decision. It really is about the book. One year we had 4 FSG books for our Strauss and Giroux. They were super excited. We just thought, oh, okay, news to us. I mean, we're really not paying attention to the publishing house.
But even in making the assignments, we often, we fall in love with the book before we take into consideration the author's publishing history, who's publishing it, anything like that. It's more comes down to just the words on the page.
I actually, as the boss, have to say, can you tell me the publisher and the pub date? Because I'm thinking about this bigger picture, because they're not thinking about that. They're really looking at the text. Sorry, and all the way in the back?
Good questions. Yeah.
Well, you've been at the book review longer. Do you want to talk about fiction versus nonfiction?
Sure. For as long as I've been there, which is 15 years, I think 15 years. I started there in 2004. It has been more nonfiction than fiction. My sense of that, if you're right that 50 years ago it went the other way, a lot of it, I'm sure, comes down to the Pamela of the time, the person who made kind of oversaw all of the coverage at the time, and what that person's preferences were, or what their bosses, how they conceived of books coverage and of the Sunday supplement, the freestanding book review. Maybe there were the daily critics spent more time looking at the nonfiction. It may have something to do with the publishing industry, and the publishing industry itself is trying to be much more topical and part of the news cycle and addressing these things in a timelier fashion. I can't speak to before my time there, but for as long as I've been there, it has been heavier nonfiction coverage. Again, more for kind of topical reasons, trying to have books speak to the culture.
I will say this too. We have an email address, books@nytimes.com, and I personally read that entire inbox and respond to everyone. You can test me on it if you really want to. It's very time consuming, but it is interesting that I can stay in touch with what readers are thinking and saying. And I will say that at least once a week, I get an email from a reader saying, how come there's no nonfiction? All I see is fiction. And then I get another email saying, why is there only nonfiction? So people are always equally disappointed.
And the cover question, your second question is, how do we decide what goes on the cover? Pamela's maybe a better person to address that, but a lot of it has to do with balance. If it was fiction one week, we might want to do nonfiction the next. A lot of it has to do with the strength of the reviews and our belief about the books. But Pamela, you oversee that every week.
Yeah, and that's a very fun process and difficult some weeks. And one of the decisions that Sam Tannenhouse made, who was my predecessor when he took over from Charles McGrath, who was before him, they each were the editor for 9 years. Sam reintroduced the cover review, which had dated back to the John Leonard days that some people might remember from the early 70s. Chip had done a sort of more topical kind of New York Review type of cover where it was headlines. And one change that I made is when Sam was still the editor, I was involved for a year in the decision of what would go on the cover. And there were certain weeks where it was like, oh God, what are we going to put on the cover? There's this crappy review of a good book. There's this good review of a terrible book. And I thought, you know what, if we don't have something, if the cover is to be meaningful, then the book should deserve the cover. And if we don't have a singular book that really deserves, or book review that deserves the cover, whether it's based on the strength of the review itself, because part of what I think, a book review is a form of writing. It's an art form, and it should be a beautiful piece of writing that is interesting reading in and of itself, apart from the, should I buy this book or not buy this book, or take it out from the library or not take it out from the library. And so if the book review isn't worthy, if the book isn't worthy, I find something else. And often that might be saying, okay, there are 3 books on a thematic issue. As a whole, for the reader, it's more interesting to look at, say, 3 books about monarchs than it would be to elevate one of these books over these others. Because for the reader, it might be interesting to compare these 3 different monarchs and to see that and that's where you have a kind of more of a magazine sensibility to offer an experience to the reader. And then for me, that then makes getting the cover for a single book review really more impactful. That's meaningful to get the cover. We're saying this deserves that attention. So there are certain weeks where we do something thematic, or we review more than one book on the cover. Sometimes we have 3 fantastic reviews that come in on a theme. Like there was one last year that were 3 very different books, but each of them was about an issue that affected sort of the health of the nation. One was Beth Macy's book on the opioid crisis. Another book was a big book on fracking. What was the third book?
Flint, maybe?
And the third one was on the Flint water crisis. And I thought, these are 3 books that are like sort of tearing at the fabric of America. And they're all strong book reviews, and they're all important books. But I can't really, they're all coming out at roughly the same time. And for the reader, I think it's more interesting to show these all together, because together they work in this way, in a way that I think running one review one week on the cover and another on the other, and then pushing a third to the middle wouldn't have
Sometimes
gone.
we see those and we assign them together as one review. And sometimes, in that case, it was 3 separate reviews, 3 separate books, and we just kind of saw after the fact that they worked together as a package and put them on the cover that way. Once a year.
No, all the time. For us, like if we were to ever judge ourselves or be judged, although now we're also very cynical about prizes. But when the Pulitzers are announced, for example, it is nice to know, yes, we covered that, or the National Book Awards, or the Nobel. And one of the reasons why I think it's really important that our decisions are made regardless sometimes of whether this book is only going to attract 300 readers, is that we are trying to find that new talent, those fresh voices, before everyone else wakes up to them. And for us, like one of the moments of pride is if a big book comes out, like City of Fire, Garth Risk Hallberg. Greg, how long had he'd been reviewing for you? For years?
Yeah, Right. So this was it was maybe not a debut novel. I think his debut novel was this little experimental thing that had come out from a tiny press. But this was like the $1 million novel called City of Fire. It was this big, ambitious thing. And everyone said, wow, who is this guy? And I said, I know who he is because I've given him books to review for something close to 10 years.
Yeah. And when Modiano won the prize, we could say, oh, yes, we've been reviewing Patrick Modiano for years. Or there was someone obscure the year before. But it's for us, in a way, we miss books all the time.
It is a point of pride to know that we've covered these things that are important. In answer to your question, we do miss things. I chose not to assign the first book in the Knausgaard cycle, the 6-book thing that he was writing. I hated it. I laughed at it. I was reading it out loud to entertain my colleagues because I thought the prose was atrocious. And then James Wood reviewed it in the New Yorker and made a case for it. And as the subsequent ones came out and it kind of built as a cultural phenomenon, I assigned them out of a sense of obligation.
You still hate Knausgaard?
I gave him a fair shake after all of that and came to appreciate the project that he was doing. I still have not recommended him to anybody. It's a question of personal taste. But I will freely admit I missed the first Knausgaard. I missed any significance behind it.
Really not. Honestly, it's part of what we do is we're a newspaper, so we do want to be newsy and try not to be very late on things. And one of the things about the book review, asking people whose job is not to review books to review a book. They don't work for us in general. And if they do work for us, sometimes we'll go to a reporter at the Times because they are a specialist in, let's say, drug trafficking, and we have a book on the subject. That's not their full-time job. They have a full-time reporting job. So they're really doing this beyond their regular work, which means we need to give them a good month to read the book and to write up a review that we think is worthy. And then we need a month because of our own print cycle ahead to get that review and to figure out when to schedule it. The book review is the only section of the Times that you can subscribe to in print without subscribing to the rest of the Times. You can't subscribe to the magazine. What's that?
I said, please do.
Yeah. But you can get the New York Times book review, and part of for that reason, we close 10 days ahead of time. So tomorrow is Wednesday. We will close not this coming Sunday, but the following Sunday. And I remember before I worked at the book review, and I was just a freelance critic for the book review, I would come in sometimes to do the podcast or something, and I would say, well, when is this running? And the editors would say, oh, I don't know what week it is. And I thought it was the most pretentious thing I'd ever heard, that you were somehow so head in the books that you didn't have any sense of time. But it's actually true, because we are closing so far ahead of time, you really lose track. We brought issues over here, that's this coming Sunday. So we've had that sitting around since last Thursday. Yeah. There have been a couple of exceptions. I will tell you a story of the most notorious exception, which was we were very excited that we negotiated a deal to publish the first story in Hilary Mantel's new collection, Sight Unseen. We just thought, it's Hilary Mantel, she's fantastic. And I will say that before the current trilogy, she'd been reviewing for us back to the 80s, I think. Yep. And we reviewed all of her early books, again, going back to that sort of recognizing people before everyone knows who they are. Anyway, the story comes in, and
I was just going to make a plug for Hilary Mantel's the Thomas Cromwell books that she's writing, which are
Bring
really
Up the Bodies,
great.
and
Wolf Hall.
Yes.
Yeah. And
the third one's coming next year. I get emails about that all the time. That, and when is the next Bob Caro? Anyway, the story comes in, and the last line, I think, is something along the lines of brilliant, fucking brilliant. And I thought, oh, God, what am I going to do? And we have a standards editor at the Times, and we did run it by him. And it was decided ultimately to run it with that. That was her language. It was essential to the story. It would have been completely silly to have put a blank there or expletive or something. But I would say that I'm a little bit proudly one of the more fuddy-duddy sections of the New York Times in terms of preserving certain traditions. What bothers me my personal thing that bothers me is politicized language. So if anything has a political euphemism or something that's just very temporary, contemporary usage, but hasn't quite gotten in the mainstream. If there's ever a term that someone somewhere is going to stop and say, what does that mean? I feel like it doesn't. If there's a clearer way for us to phrase it in the book review, we do it that way. But yeah, no, I mean, people who speak without the conditional, for example, drive me nuts. And if I see it in print, we correct it.
For myself,
You're
I
hipper than
came
me.
up through the copy desk of the Times. I was a copy editor before I was an assigning editor. And so I internalized a lot of the Times's the style book, the standards rules, where we had to really crack down on that stuff. And so I still do that, but I'm also a big believer in giving reviewers their voice. And so some reviewers, Cynthia Ozick is beautiful, such elevated language. She writes, and I mean, even her emails are this very high flown, and I love those. And that's the kind of thing that you're talking about.
The collected emails of Cynthia Ozick is something that I one day want to see.
But there are other reviewers who are younger who are write much more colloquially than she does, and we keep the coarse tone out, but we welcome a conversational tone. We welcome jokes, or we don't want to be the section that puts people to sleep either. And Cynthia Ozick doesn't do that. But there's room in the book review for a wide range of voices.
Yeah.
We do try to keep the coarse language out, but we encourage kind of all different tones.
I mean, if you're going to ask someone that is not a professional critic to write a review for whatever reason, whether it's a comedian like Judd Apatow or Michael Ian Black, or someone who, she's a great writer, but primarily a singer like Patti Smith to write, like, part of what makes that special is to retain what is special about their own voice. And sometimes that their style or taste might not be the same as ours, but we feel like that's part of having a diverse offer. So one of the nice things about the New York Times is that we are not constantly beholden to the numbers. There's a strong church-state divide between us and the advertising side. There's a little bit more partnership in terms of strategy when things come to business, but we're not looking at constantly at the numbers. But I would say that the readership of the New York Times is growing, and with that, the readership of the book review is growing, as it is for all of our books coverage. One of the, when I talk about some of the changes that we're making, the idea for us is to preserve the areas of the book's coverage that make us original and who we are, that differentiate us from everywhere else, that are our core strength. And some of that is the reviewing of books that are poetry books that have a small audience, experimental fiction that has a small audience, or really important scholarly work that has a small audience, and not worrying too much about how many people are reading that. The subscription figures for the New York Times are for the paper as a whole in terms of the print paper. We know to a certain extent that the book review is one of the most read and most loved sections of the Sunday book review and of the Sunday package, and is considered essential to that, and is not going away anytime soon, for sure, if ever, I hope. But beyond that, we don't get numbers of like how many people are. We don't judge by that. Oh, for by the book, or for the regular features?
Oh, the by the book. So by the book is the question and answer, the little questionnaire where they say what they're reading, what's on their nightstand, who they would invite to a dinner party. That's what you're talking about? So Pamela started that section and ran it for 5 years, 6 years?
Something, yeah.
And then when I took over as senior editor last year, I've been doing it for the past year. So I try to come up with the subjects for that column the same way we talked about picking the cover reviews, trying to come up with a mix of fiction and nonfiction. I try to do the same thing. I look for a mix of professional writers and people who've written a book but might be an actor or a singer or some other thing. I look for. There's a lot of just instinct in would this person, so I'll say, I'm pretty sure that Joe Namath, the famous Jets quarterback, is coming out with a memoir this year, and the publicist came to me and said, would you like him for By the Book? And he's a big name. He's somebody I would consider for By the Book. And I said, well, tell me, does he read much? And the answer came back, no. And I said, I'm not interested. And so the whole point of the By the Book interviews are not about this person's book that's coming out. It's about revealing something about their personality, their worldview through the books that they're reading. They're not talking about their own book, but they're talking about their reading life. That's what By the Book is. So here are the books that mattered to me growing up. Here are the books that I'm really excited about right now. Here, and that can reveal a lot about a person, and that's the whole premise of the By the Book.
I mean, it started off as when it was begun, the idea was we should do a profile in the book review. And I thought, well, what it would make a profile in the book review any different from a profile in any other section of the paper? And so we decided that we would do this profile through a questionnaire that would get at something about them. As it turns out, it's like, I describe it as like entertainment television, or like the Oscars red carpet, but for, nerds. Instead of like, what are you wearing? It's what are you reading? So in some sense, it's a sort of like famous word of mouth, and people use it for recommendations. But I have always read it on a deeper level. Like for me, it's really interesting that, for example, Ellen Hildenbrand, who is a largely commercial author, very popular. We don't generally review her books. She's a really smart and interesting literary reader. She handed in this great, By the Book, that she's got a wide range of interests. And I feel like you can tell when someone's lying and exaggerating, and that's very telling too. We've had a bunch of politicians and public figures, and they have like a very carefully curated nightstand that somehow represents every single possible race, nationality, and genre on their nightstand. Whether or not you believe that, is up to you. And so again, I feel like there are these interesting revelations, and sometimes you get someone who you think is super literary and it's going to be great, and then you realize this person does not read at all, or people's reading taste just surprise you. So that, for that reason, the idea when I first started it was the first three people I asked at the time, and this was going back to 2012. I thought, well, who would I want to know what they're reading? And I thought, David Sedaris. I'm a huge David Sedaris fan. I love him. One of the things that I love about when he goes on tour, if you've ever gone to hear him talk, he always recommends a book. He's made people's writing career. He basically made Sarah Vowell into a best-selling author. There are people that he's picked and gotten behind because he reads. So I thought, if he says yes, I'll be okay. And I remember, emailing him. I was very nervous, and he emailed back. We got into these back and forth exchanges, and I remember I would carefully plot out each email. People said, don't try to be funny with the funny man, like you're the straight person on. But eventually he agreed. The second person to agree was Lena Dunham, and I remember Sam Tannenhouse was the editor. This was before Girls had come out, and I was like, I think she's going to be big. And the third person was Madeleine Albright, and I would say like those three people together, kind of that said yes, encapsulate like what we're trying to do. You have someone who's a best-selling author; everyone knows who he is. You have someone who's an up-and-comer. We don't necessarily know that much about her, and then you have someone who is, a huge public figure and a really interesting background, and she doesn't really ever, even though she's a well-known figure, we don't really know that much about her reading life. Well, the print subscription base of the New York Times is roughly stable, which in this landscape is like really good, I have to say. And the digital readership has just gone up exponentially. What the internet has enabled us to do is to think, sometimes not everything needs to go in print. Sometimes there's something that we really want to just comment on, write about very quickly. We can do a quick recommendation list, a preview of what's coming. We have a feature that it actually does now run in print, but it was conceived of digitally, called Newsbook, where we say, this week in the headlines is families being separated at the border. If you're interested in like getting a deeper view on that than what you're reading in the headlines and in these news stories, here are 3 books that can offer some background. Here's a novel that looked at that as a theme. Here's a book reported from the front, and here's a book 10 years ago.
Or
that
a
was
memoir
written.
by somebody who went through
Yeah,
that.
and like so that's something that was conceived of digitally. It ran digitally only for a while. That kind of thing we might be doing digitally. It doesn't necessarily go in the book review. The book review, to my mind, is a little bit like the cream of the crop. But most things will appear in both
And
places somewhere.
digitally, I mean, the whole world of digital publishing gives us a lot more possibilities. When Russell Baker just died, we could say, here are the 6 books you should read by Russell Baker if you want a sense of what he was all about and what he was doing. And that ran as a list online and never in print, but it was our way of offering our readers something. We didn't need to work up a whole big article or find space for it in print, but we could say, people are curious about Russell Baker right now.
Another thing about the book's coverage now in this new centralized landscape with thinking about things digitally first, which I know it's a phrase of good and evil. I'm using it in the good way here, which is that sometimes we just think like, what is the story that we want to write? And where it ends up in the physical paper, now that we're not just the book review on our own, we'll figure it out later. So you might notice if you read the print paper, which I still do every day, you will see book stories sometimes in the international pages or the national section or the Sunday business section. They're book stories. They're actually stories that our staff here worked on, but they are in the business section maybe because it's looking at a business angle or it's about a business author. I mean, we got a really nice email. There was a Q&A with Tracy Smith in the Sunday business section this
She's
week.
the poet laureate.
There was one day last year, we had both stories on what's called the dress page, which is the first page of any section of the national section. One was about a storied Black publisher out of Chicago, a small press, and sort of celebrating an anniversary. And I can't remember what the other one was, but I thought.
And I mean, from time to time, we get stories on the front on page A1 too. So we're always kind of looking at where our stories might fit in, and it's not necessarily the arts page or the Sunday Book Review. It's kind of what's the angle here.
So they're even longer in real life because I get really interested in the conversations. They sometimes go on for quite a while, and I don't actually listen to the edited version after because I can't listen to myself. But the New York Times Book Review podcast is the oldest, longest running podcast at the Times. It was started up by Dwight Garner when he was at the Book Review together with Sam Tannenhouse, and back at a period where everyone was like, "What is this thing?" It was like back when people it was like weblog, that day before blog. No one knew what it was. And it runs every week. And when Sam transitioned during the transition period between Sam and me, he actually didn't leave the book review first. He left the podcast first, and he didn't really let me know. He said, "Why don't you come on as a guest? We're doing a special grand finale of my podcast." And I was like, "Okay, sure." And I was like, "Wait, what?" Because I wasn't actually the editor of the book review. So the following week, I just had to go in and go on, and it was terrifying because it was not my natural medium, and I had always been on the other side of the microphone when one of my books would come out and I would be interviewed. So the way that I approach it now, and it's one of my favorite parts of the job, is really as a reader and as a reporter. It's a little bit of reporting that I still get to do. And so I choose the guests based, frankly, on my own interest, because I think that if I think that this book is interesting, it'll come out in the interview. And if it's something that I'm honestly curious about and engaged in, we'll choose a critic over the book review because sometimes I think the critic is more interesting to talk to. And also if the review is very critical, then I think I'm not going to bring in that poor author to be like, how do you feel? And the third thing I would say is, sometimes too, the author doesn't speak English as a first language. It's a Borken translation. So I recently had on A.O. Scott, the film critic, to talk about Lynn Ullman's novel. Now, she actually does speak excellent English. But I thought it would be interesting to talk to him specifically because for those of you who don't know, Lynn Ullman is a very celebrated novelist in her home country of Norway, and she is also the daughter of Ingmar Bergman and Liv Ullman. And I thought, given that we have the film critic reviewing this book, he is also a really good literary critic, and was at the New York Review of Books for a long time, that he could talk about that in the context, and that we could also broaden the conversation to talk about film. So in that instance, I chose to talk to him. And I do try, a lot of what I'm doing in my daily work in terms of talking to authors is getting a sense of who I think will be a good interview. So there are luncheons that publishers will have for authors, and I go to all of those. If someone has something interesting to say at those luncheons, I think that this person I sort of note it, will be a good guest on the podcast when the book comes out. Some people aren't very good at talking about their books, unfortunately, and it's particularly, and I don't fault them for this because it's hard to talk about fiction for a lot of novelists. For a lot of novelists, it's really about what's on the page. So I try to get as many fiction authors on the podcast as I can, but I will choose people based on whether I have experience, whether I know them and know that they're able to talk about their work, or if there's something idea-driven or something really interesting in the structure of the novel or the timeliness of the subject that I think will make for a good conversation. There are many brilliant novelists out there, and it's kind of shocking that they can't really talk about their work. They can read from it beautifully, but they can't really talk about it. So it's really about finding someone I'm interested in who I think will actually be an interesting conversation. Because the podcast, I've come to realize over time, and I think this is more and more the case, especially as we enter into the sort of golden age of podcasting, the audience for the podcast is not the audience for the book review. There's an overlap. But when Sam was doing it, he would base the podcast 100% on what the book review was, thinking it's a supplement. Now, our listenership is global. I mean, we get emails and letters from people all around the world, and often they don't read the book review at all, don't even know that there is a book review. And the saddest thing, although it's bittersweet, is when I get an email saying, like, I love the podcast and I don't even have to read the book review anymore now. So I've gone beyond the scope of the book review on occasion. There's sometimes someone really interesting is in town from abroad. If Hilary Mantel is in town, I don't care if she doesn't have a new book out, I'd like to talk to her. Or if someone wins a prize and they're doing a tour, I might have them in. So we tell publishers and agents and authors, if you're passing through town, let us know. We might have you in. And then sometimes we just go completely off of the book review. Like I had George Goodall on, and it was a great conversation. I don't know who here listens to audiobooks, but he is like the #1 narrator of audiobooks. And I mean, who wouldn't want to talk to him? Like, how does he pick the books? What does he do if he hates it? So he came on, and we sort of go a little bit broader than that. Is that the last one? All right. Thank you.
Thank you all.